Hi everyone, this is Andreas and
Michael.
from cloudonaut, and this is the first time for so long, like that we are on a show together. I'm so excited about this. So we are starting a new weekly cloudonaut show. We are naming it Hot Off the Cloud, and this weekly show is all about AWS news, our lessons learned, and as well your questions. Okay, Michael, so I would like to start with the AWS news. So we are looking back at the last week, and we are looking into what AWS has announced. We are not going through all the announcements. We are going through those announcements that we find interesting, and we have some notes or some insights into those as well. The announcement is Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager now automates archival of EBS snapshots. And I was wondering, okay, what is this all about? So I was looking into that, like I always do when I scroll through the news. And so first of all, the Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager is actually the EC2 Data Lifecycle Manager, because it's only about EBS snapshots, AMI, stuff like that. So that's the first misleading name here. And then we all know EBS snapshots. So Michael, we have been doing a lot of snapshots in our in the past few years, right? So this is very basic stuff. But then some time ago, AWS announced an archive feature for EBS snapshots. So basically that's a way you can, maybe, I would say, so that's the marketing side says, it allows you to lower your costs for EBS snapshots because you're putting them on cold storage. So I don't know, think of it like Glacier, Deep Archive, something like that in the background probably. So that's what this is about. So why is it interesting? So the standard price for an EBS snapshot, I looked that up, is $5 per gigabyte per month. And with EBS Snapshots Archive, it's 1.2 US dollar cents per gigabyte per month. So that's a significant difference. So cutting price by, 4 times, something like that. So that might be interesting. Okay. So then I looked into what is this EBS Snapshot Archive all about. So how does that work? And basically the first thing I stumbled upon is, that's very interesting. So usually when we do EBS snapshots and you're snapshotting a volume multiple times, you are only storing the difference. So you're only storing you're doing only incremental backups for the volume, right? And so that means when the data on your volume doesn't change a lot, also the storage you need for additional snapshots of the same volume is not that significant. But if you use EBS Snapshots Archive, every time you're doing a full snapshot. So you don't have any incremental snapshots anymore, which means I would say you can even increase your costs for EBS backups, because if you have a lot of data that is changing over time and you're doing a snapshot archive or storing that as an archive, you're at the end paying more than that. It's possible at least. So at least if the data changes very frequently. So yeah, I think this is a big warning about the way the snapshot archive works. And I think the use cases are probably, I don't know, Michael, what do you think about it? But I think probably most scenarios, the data on a volume doesn't change too much. So I would assume be very careful with using that method to reduce your costs. Okay. And then I looked into what does the Data Lifecycle Manager do. So basically the announcement is that the Data Lifecycle Manager now, this is a feature, I would say, of EC2 that you can use to create snapshots of an instance or of certain volumes. So basically what it does, you configure a schedule and then it just takes a snapshot, a crash consistent snapshot. So I think it's totally useless, but okay. It's doing that and it's taking snapshots, and but the feature that they added here is that you now configure the data lifecycle policy in a way that it archives the snapshots after a certain amount of time, or it archives the snapshots, a certain number of snapshots that it keeps around. So that's basically what this is all about. Michael, does a question come to your mind when you hear about the data lifecycle manager that I described here? Does that sound familiar, that feature set?
Yeah, I think it somehow kind of overlaps with AWS Backup, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so
I think
I
it was there
wondering
before AWS Backup, but I'm not.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't think it has been around too long, because I think it's also more a newish kind of feature. Yeah, I wonder what this is all about, because AWS Backup is, I would say, doing more or less the same thing. And I don't really get why we need two different services for that. Maybe because they had two pizzas, so they needed two teams. I don't know. Is that so? Work on the same stuff. We don't care. I don't know. Maybe there's a good reason. I don't know. I haven't heard any good reason. I was asking around about that on Twitter today. Yeah. Okay. But yeah. Okay. Nevertheless, so AWS Backup, on the other side, does not support any cold storage for EBS snapshots. It supports it for other services that it backups, but not for EBS. So it's not integrating with the archival feature for EBS snapshots yet. So, okay. Yeah. So I don't know. I would say overall, the whole announcement, probably the whole feature of EBS snapshot archives is probably not too interesting to most of us. Probably only in very, very rare cases where you, I don't know, have data that changes very, very frequently and you have to keep it around for a long time, stuff like that. Maybe then this is an interesting announcement for you, but it's also very, I don't know, a little interesting to go through all that.
But I'm glad, Andreas, that you looked into it. So because that's always the problem with AWS news, right? So sometimes there is something that is really significant, and sometimes it's not really significant for your workload. So thanks for all the details. The one that I picked next, the news item that I picked, is very tiny, and it actually is that you can now change the AWS support plan without using the root user. So there is basically IAM permissions for doing that. So I think there are 3 new IAM actions. For I think the service name is support plans or something. And you basically now can change the support plan as a standard IAM user role if you have the permissions. And they also made some changes to the UI. So I hadn't looked into the new UI because, that's not really, you use this basically once and then you never touch it again. But the IAM thing is definitely, I think, cool, because this was always something that you have to do when you set up accounts, log in with the root user to enable the support plan. But that kind of is still, what still is missing, even with this announcement, is that there is still, in every account you have to enable the support plan. So there's no organization support. So it's, I think, maybe step 1 in that direction. Maybe we will see something here in the near future. The next.
So Michael, I have one question. One question on that. So did you say that they created a new service namespace for the IAM actions? Yes. Okay. Yes. Of course, I was wondering, how do they achieve that without breaking anything? Because maybe someone has, I don't know, support asterisk, and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the next news item is interesting for everyone that uses Systems Manager. And basically what we can now do is we can stop an automation, a run command, a state manager, or maintenance window based on a CloudWatch alarm. So you can configure a CloudWatch alarm, and if that alarm goes off, so if it's in the alarm state, it stops the automation or the run command tasks or the state manager or the maintenance window. So the example from the AWS docs is that if you have a maintenance window that patches all your instances, and you realize by looking at the CloudWatch alarm that the application is down because, I don't know, maybe the patching is not working, or it just patches all the instances into a state where they're not working anymore, you can basically stop the whole update process. And if you are familiar with the fault injection simulator service, it's very similar concept. They also have the way to kind of configure an AWS alarm. And if that alarm goes off, it stops the experiment. So that's kind of the same functionality in SSM now, which is, I think, quite cool because now we have an integrated way to kind of stop that. I think before that you had to look at the CloudWatch YARN yourself and kind of trigger all the API calls yourself, and now it's kind of embedded. I have no details about how often does SSM check the CloudWatch alarm, something like this, so there's not much documentation about it, at least what I saw. Maybe that is added later, but yeah, still I think a nice little feature if you're using SSM.
Okay, so Michael, do you think, so we are using SSM from time to time to, I don't know, patch instances and stuff like that. Do you think we can make use of it? Or, because I was wondering a little bit, so it probably takes quite a lot of time until the CloudWatch alarm fires, that is monitoring an instance and an application running on that. So do you think this is something we could build into our systems, or do you think it's...
I don't think so, because we have no EC2 instances that serve traffic. So we just have, I think we have maybe 1 or 2 EC2 instances that do some background tasks. Like one does the claim AV mirror syncing, but there's no CloudWatch alarm that goes off if it kind of breaks. There is a CloudWatch alarm, but this is in S3. So basically with the S3 replication, but we detect that much too late. So the patching is already done at this time. So I don't think we have a good use case for it, but if you use it like in front, like for EC2 instances that are in front of a load balancer, then you could just look at the healthy, healthy host count metric or something like this, and then I think it makes sense. I mean, if it's only just a very few number of instances, it's probably too late until it stops, but yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, interesting. So Michael, yes, thanks for looking into that. I skipped that part, but I did another one, got my attention, and this was the announcement of the general availability of Amazon File Cache. So this sounded great. So I was reading a lot of tweets, and I thought, okay, let's look into what this is all about. And yeah, so I checked it out, and so yeah, what can I say about it? So first of all, the Amazon File Cache is part of the FSX services. So those are the things where you can get a Windows file server, open CFS, NetApp, stuff like that. So basically more advanced or more legacy, I don't know how to call them. So, or a more, more fine granular ways for storage systems on AWS. Maybe let's say it like that. And so I was first, in my head, my first model in my mind was that this is just another FSX file system, so like a Windows file server or something. But then I got into the details. So what is Amazon File Cache all about? So it's part of that service, but it's not a file system. They call it a cache. So it's a little different. The concept is a little different. And so the file cache is basically a caching layer for either S3 or an NFS share. So that could be NFS in your on-premises environment or on AWS. And S3, okay, that's the service that AWS provides for storing objects. So that's basically a caching layer in front of that. And what you get, okay, it's, as the name implies, it's caching the data. So you get, after the thing is in cache, you have fast access to that. And also what you get is a POSIX interface. So basically, the operating system can access those things in a way like it handles other volumes or other file storage systems. The whole thing is based on, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Lustre, which is an open source distributed parallel file system. And it basically wraps S3 and NFS in the background and acts as a cache in between. So to get things running, you need to install this Lustre client on your EC2 instances or wherever you want to use the whole thing. So this is a requirement to get that working. And then I think what probably the interesting part of it is you have a central caching layer. So there are other systems that do similar things, Michael. You have, I think sometimes we touch those S3 file systems that then have caches on local disk and stuff like that, and they work more or less not so well typically to access files on S3. I think the interesting part here is that you have a centralized caching layer. So all systems connect to the same caching layer, and so you can invalidate the cache, log files, stuff like that. So that's maybe an interesting approach. So I found that quite interesting for use cases where EC2 instances need to access files stored on S3. So I think we, in multiple use cases, we have been in situations where that would be interesting, mostly when it comes to migrating legacy applications, stuff like that. That might be an interesting feature. Okay, so I was very excited about this service, and I looked a little deeper into the details, and then I checked the pricing, because that's often where things come to an end, so the whole fun stops there. But pricing is, I would say, it's quite interesting. So you just pay for the storage. So you pay for the storage that you provision for your cache. Okay, sounds fine. I don't know. It's $1.33 per gigabyte per month. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't seem too important. But then I tried to spin up a cache myself. I just wanted to try it, and then I stumbled upon something. The minimum cache size is 1.2 terabytes. Okay, so now you do the math, and this ends up costing you a minimum $1,600 per month. So to spin up the whole thing. So I don't think this is something for small legacy applications that you want to transfer to AWS. I think this is really for, I don't know, huge legacy applications, and you just want to have a caching layer in front. Probably the use case for this is you want to fix a problem where the system is too slow, and you're just adding a cache, and no one cares about the costs. Maybe that's the use case for the product. I don't know. This was a little a downer, that this is not really probably interesting for most of us. But still maybe interesting to know that this option is around. And by the way, you can use it in any way. So you can use it either from EC2. They say you can use it from containers, okay, because you can just encapsulate that into your container image. You could even use it from on-premises as well. So that's also a scenario that AWS has in mind for that. So so when you...
I think, Andreas, the scenario with on-premises is kind of the other way around. So if you access on-premises data from AWS, you could use the file cache in between, as far as I understand. But maybe you can use it the other way around.
Yes, well. that's another. I think all those scenarios are valid. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's just a caching layer in between. Probably it makes more sense to use the cache on AWS side, because then you benefit from the latency and the network latency and stuff. Yeah, that makes more sense probably. You're right. Okay.
So let's have a short break. So I think that's all the news, right, that we have in mind for this week, and it's already like a big list of things. So let's have a short break, and if you are looking for a new job, the good news here is that AWS expertise is in high demand, and we have two partners looking for AWS experts. The first partner is TechRaiser, and they are hiring cloud consultants focusing on AWS and DevOps. So you should apply when you like building infrastructure as code and containers, for example. You join TechRaiser in one of these locations. So they are in Germany, Hanover, Duisburg, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Munich. They are in Austria, Vienna, and in Portugal, Lisbon, and in Switzerland, Lucerne. I think that are all the cities here. And also our second partner, Demicon, is hiring a senior lead full stack developer. And this is a remote position, but you have to be based in the EU. And your favorite technology stack should include things like JavaScript or TypeScript, Angular or React. And of course, it should also include AWS, right? So that is something that all our positions have in common. So if one of these sounds interesting to you, check out the show notes, and you will find links to the positions and also some details there on what our partners here have to offer you. So let's dive into the next section. So that's the lessons learned section. So this is where we share basically 1 or 2 things that we learned about AWS in the past week. And this week, Andreas has learned something new that he wants to share with us, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, Michael, I was diving a little into EC2 auto recovery. So, Michael, do you remember how things worked in the beginning with EC2? Do you remember what was the thing we always told students starting with AWS? Can you give us a short summary?
So I don't know if that's the beginning, but the thing that I remember is that there is a CloudWatch metric. I don't remember the exact name, but it's something like if the instance is basically healthy or not. And you can create a CloudWatch alarm on that metric, and if it turns to 1, you can trigger a recovery action. And that was kind of the way to migrate a EC2 instance off to another host if things break on the host where it was running.
Yeah, exactly. So by default, in the past, AWS was not recovering failed EC2 instances. So whenever the underlying hardware, the virtualization layer, whatever failed, your instance just failed and was in a failed state and did not recover automatically. So what you could do is you could create a CloudWatch alarm and use a special metric and then use that to recover the instance, which basically meant launching the same instance on another machine. Then recently, AWS announced simplified automatic recovery. And they announced that they enable that for all instances, new instances and existing instances by default. You can opt out of that feature if you want to. You don't have to use that feature, but by default it's on for all the instances that are running. Simplified automatic recovery means AWS, that's the promise, will automatically recover your instance after failure. You don't have to care about that anymore. It's basically happening automatically out of the box. This sounded great. And I was, while I was reworking a chapter in our book, AWS in Action, I was just diving a little into the details of that. And then I stumbled upon a detail in the AWS documentation. Because there, AWS says that either service health dashboard events or events that impact the underlying rack of an EC2 instance will lead to the fact that the simplified automatic recovery will not take place, and you will not even get notified about that at all. So that's written in the documentation. I was, oh, that sounds cool. So if shit hits the fan, it just stops working and they do nothing with my machine. They announced that feature. Okay, cool. But I can really make use of it. Okay, cool. Very cool. Okay, on the other hand, it maybe makes a little sense, because how would you... So in reality, what happens if you suffer a huge outage in a data center? It's of course not possible that you at the same second replace, I don't know, thousands of machines. That's just not happening, right? So I think it makes sense that it's not working, but maybe you shouldn't promise that it will work at the first place. So that is what I learned about. So yeah, so the simplified automatic recovery will basically only work if only a single instance or very few instances are affected by the outage, and not if the whole rack or more instances are affected at the same time. Cool. Okay. And then I was checking on that today for preparing for this show again, and I was reading through documentation once again, and later they say, and even for CloudWatch action-based recovery events, we are not 100% sure if we really can fulfill your needs in case of a larger outage. And of course that makes sense, because if you think about larger outages that we have all observed, typically not only one AWS service is affected. So if EC2, for example, is affected, it affects other AWS services as well. And it's of course possible that, for example, CloudWatch stops working and the whole firing of the action is not taking place correctly. So yeah, this is just probably it's just a disclaimer basically that this functionality might not work in reality. But overall, what I think, of course I don't know exactly, but what I get from the documentation is it still makes sense to define your CloudWatch alarms to trigger the recovery action instead on relying on the simplified automatic recovery, because chances are that this might work better in the end than right now. So I think that's maybe the learning that I take away from that. So EC2 auto recovery, we're still doing it the old-fashioned way with CloudWatch alarms, and we ignoring the simplified automatic one, I would say, at least for machines that we care about.
Okay, Andreas, I see. And I think that like the downside is that you have to pay for the CloudWatch alarm. I think that's like the only costs that are attached to this kind of workaround that you suggested. So that's okay, right?
That's maybe fine, yeah.
Yeah.
for a little bit more liability. Okay, maybe if someone from AWS watches that has more insights into that, I would be really interested into the real details here. So let me know. Okay.
All right.
So we are approaching the last section of this show, and this is Ask Cloudonaut. So this is here for all your questions that you want to send to Michael and me. You can send in questions whenever you like. Use the hashtag askcloudonaut, send us an email, DM, what have you. Or, of course, if you have joined the live stream, you can ask your questions right now in the chat. And I will start. So it's always good to have a starting point, right? So the first question that I have is coming in from Xavier, and he has written in a few days ago, and he asks, in a previous article about the limit of 25,000 events, you mentioned that you're using step functions to list objects within an S3 bucket. And I was wondering if you could share some details on this. So Michael, this is a question for you. You have written about that. Tell us about what was the problem, what's the whole thing about, why are you using step functions, what are you doing there? Give us an overview of the whole thing, please.
Yeah, I was just sending the link to the post into the chat so we can also attach this to the show notes later. So basically the problem is that in a step function execution, you can have, there is a limit of 25,000 so-called history events. So the problem is, what is a history event is actually not so easy to understand, because what we as a creator of a step function state machine use or interact with are states and state transitions. So we don't really know about history events. And my very first idea of step functions is that each state transition adds up to this limit by 1. So if I have one state transition, it counts as one history event. Turns out that's not correct. So that was the pitfall that I was running into, because lots of state transitions have or kind of issue, for example, 3 history events or even 7 or something. And that's why I was running into the limit, because my mental model was wrong. So my assumption was that each state transition is one history event, but that's not true. Okay, so the first thing you have to understand is that each state or each task that you execute, each task type emits a different amount of history events. And I have a couple of examples in the blog post if you're interested in. So for example, a lambda function, which is, I think, the one that I use most often, is a task state type, and that usually emits 5 history events, but it's not documented and not kind of guaranteed. I don't know what happens if there come strange errors and things like that. Okay, so that was the problem. And my use case was that I was listing all the objects in an S3 bucket, and this includes all versions in a bucket. And this should work for up to 100 million objects in an in a bucket. And that's why I was running into the limits. And in the blog post, I have 2 kind of strategies that you can apply to kind of work around the limit. The one is from AWS, the recommended one from AWS is to kind of, like, if you approach the limit, launch a new step function execution. And I'm always a little bit skeptical about those solutions, because it's very easy to kind of create an infinite loop and kind of have a very big AWS bill at the end of the month or the end of the day, depending on your implementation. So the approach that I kind of suggest, if it's doable, is that you increase the kind of task size in each batch that you basically run. So in my case, I first started with listing 1,000 objects in a kind of page or in a state. And this is like the default that's returned by S3. And then I changed my implementation to kind of like one function actually loads a couple of pages. In this case, I think 1,000 pages or something, which still executes within reasonable amount of time, which is like 30 seconds or something. So well below the lambda limit. And so those are the kind of strategies that you can use to kind of work around the limit. And now my implementation should work for up to, I think, 250 million objects or something, which is not, I mean, you can have infinite amount of objects in a bucket, so it's not working for all buckets, but for all the buckets that my solution has to work for, so far it is working. And I think for other solutions, I wouldn't recommend using step functions because you pay for the list calls in S3. And I actually, like all my testing and implementation, I think the bill was kind of, at the end of the month when this account was added, I think I added $1,000 to the bill at the end of the month or something, just because I made so many API calls to the S3 API. So I think if you really have to list more or larger buckets, then you can use, I think it's called the inventory or something, S3 inventory. It's like a big report or multiple files that are reported by S3 that list all the objects in a big file or multiple files. I think that is then the better option to get all the files.
What's the reason for implementing listing S3 objects with step functions from the first place? I think that was the original question.
Oh, so I forgot about that. Yeah, sorry. So what we do is we offer a product. It's called Bucket AV. It's an antivirus solution for Amazon S3. And what we have is real-time scanning. So if a new file is added, it is scanned. We also have this feature where you can scan a bucket at regular intervals. So for example, every week, every month, or every day if you wish, you can scan all the files in the bucket because the virus definitions update a couple of times each day. So even if you scan all the files when they arrive, it could be that one file went through, but then you will catch it maybe 1 week later when the virus database is updated and now contains the new definition for this new thread that arrived in the meantime. So that's what kind of the background here. So that's why we have to list all the files. But I can imagine there are other scenarios where you basically want to list all the files. Maybe you just want to do some cleanup of access control list, like the old stuff. I think there are like also other ways to do that. But yeah, sometimes you have to go through all the files, and in this case I do this very regularly, or our customers do this very regularly, so most of them use it, I think, weekly. And so this has to be, like, from a cost perspective, it has to be as efficient as possible, and it also has to cover all the like bucket size ranges that our customers have. And it turns out that like more than a handful of customers want to scan buckets with lots of files, like hundreds of millions of files per day. And so that's why we have to, or why I changed this implementation. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for the explanation, Michael. And yes, we have a question in the chat. Thanks, JJ. And by the way, Anton, also hi. Nice to see you here. JJ writes in, random question, how would you go about implementing a multi-region when possible serverless cron job on AWS? For example, if you had to run 1 million cron jobs regularly and only wanted to run each once. Michael, this is a tricky one. Do you have
the funny story here is that I actually had a very similar question from a customer, and this was a couple of years ago, and the only thing that was not included was the multi-region thing. It was just they wanted to run it in a single region, and this is a very hard problem, and I don't think that there's a good solution on AWS to build this thing, even if it's not multi-region. And there is no service for that. I think there's really a cron job service missing in AWS. I mean, we have EventBridge, but it's not really for, I mean, it's for, you can have a couple of routes, but not like millions like this, like that JJ wants to implement. Yeah. And yeah, I think there are a couple of questions that are needed before we can really answer this. And I don't think there's a good answer to the question. So that's the first thing. But one question would be, what's the minimum interval, and what's the longest interval the cron job will run? Like, is it like the minimum is a minute, a day, or maybe every 5 minutes, and this up to 10 years or 100 years? And depending on all of those factors, it gets really hard. And so what I did back then was I used step functions, because with step functions, you can wait for free. Like waiting time is, I mean, it's a state transition. You pay for it once, but not for the duration. And the problem is you cannot have 1 million state executions running at the same time. So this does not work for JJ's use case because there's just too many cron jobs running. But this is what we did for the customer. And then we use this pattern that I, like previously I said, it's a kind of, you have to be careful when using this pattern. We use the step function that executes itself because the step function execution is limited to 1 year, and they had cron jobs that basically were running kind of forever. So we made sure that they, like every year, they kind of renew themselves. And this is super hard to test and everything because, I mean, you cannot really wait for 1 year to see if it actually works. So you have to tweak all the settings and see that it works properly. And you have to be careful of the history events limit and all these things. And it's complicated. So maybe, Andreas, you have a better idea.
So, also funny story. I've implemented something like this as well. So it is. I think it is. It was at the very beginning of this whole serverless thing. So I don't know, 4 years, 5 years ago. I don't know. Remember exactly. And actually, the issue was the same. So the thing was, we had a huge list of cron jobs that should be triggered. And what I ended up is I created, I don't recommend that at all. This was an implementation I did many years ago. I wouldn't recommend it, but just how I solved it. I basically had a DynamoDB table with all the cron jobs. And as far as I remember, I had, let me think about it. I had something that I had a way to use a sort key to get only the cron jobs that I need to run in an iteration. And then I had a Lambda function that was called by an event bridge rule, I think, I don't know, every minute or something. And this was just going through the list and only through the parts of the list from DynamoDB, and I was scanning through, are there any jobs that I need to run? Because basically I used something like, I calculated the timestamp when the job needs to run. And basically, I just sorted the list by this timestamp. This was, I think, the implementation. And yeah, the Lambda function was just every minute checking if there are any jobs basically in the DynamoDB table. And then the Lambda function was triggering either Fargate jobs or other Lambda functions that were then executing the workload. But yeah. I think it scaled quite well to the extent that I needed it. It was a few thousand cron jobs when I remember it correctly. I'm not sure if that would scale to millions of cron jobs, maybe not. And it had some other issues. So yeah, I think that's the best one I came up with over the past years, but I never got a totally fine solution for that I'm proud of.
Yeah, but I think the good news here is that for JJ is that I don't think that you will find anyone to kind of draft your solution for this in 5 minutes because it's a bigger problem to solve.
Maybe there's someone who has solved it, but we are definitely not the ones. Perfect. Very good question.
But maybe like if you find an answer to that problem, or if you come up with a solution that actually works, then please reach out to us and share that with us. So we have like this kind of share your architecture thing where we write about architectures in AWS from AWS users, and this would be very interesting. So feel free to reach out to us once this is working.
Okay, Michael, this was a lot of fun. So this was the first try. With our weekly show, Hot of the Cloud. We had a lot of AW news, we had lessons learned, we had questions from you, the community. I think this is really great. We will be back next week.
Great, thank you.
Bye.